Gavin. I work as a raptor biologist here and also with the Condor program. This is my 11th season working here, and I'm just going to take you through some aspects of raptor monitoring and Pinnacles. I'll just start with talking about what raptors are, and then we can look at how do we monitor raptors at the park and why do we do that. If you have questions, you can definitely holler as I'm going along. It's not super formal, and it won't throw me off base so much if you have burning questions. So yeah, feel free as we're going along. Okay. So, all right. So first of all, what are raptors? Does anybody know what a raptor is? You can shout out if you do.
Bird with a hooked beak?
Yeah. Yep. Basically, raptor means bird of prey. Sometimes when I say that I work with raptors, visitors will say, you mean like velociraptors? Like everybody's seen Jurassic Park, like a dinosaur. Now, velociraptor, raptor, the sort of Latin root of that is rapere, which means to seize or to grasp something. So velociraptor means something that's quick and you can seize something. So that's kind of what that dinosaur name came from. So, you know, it's not totally off base. Yeah, and as Sierra mentioned, all raptors have sharp talons and hooked beaks. That refers to raptors that are out in the day, like hawks and falcons and things like that, as well as those at night, like owls. Okay. So, I don't know if people know what these are, but these are American kestrels. It's a type of falcon. It's the smallest falcon that we have in the park that nests. So there are a few different main types of raptors that we have here. And I'll just kind of show those. From left to right, that's a Prairie Falcon. And then we've got a sharp-shinned hawk, red-shouldered hawk, and golden eagle. These fit into some main groups that we have. Falcons are they're kind of like bullets. They're really streamlined, kind of pointed wings, just sort of pointed all over. They're very fast. They're aerial predators. Then you've got things like sharp-shinned hawks, which are known as accipiters. It's a type of hawk. The next one over, red-shouldered hawks are buteos. So we've got accipiter hawk and buteo hawks. You don't need to know all the specific jargon of this. Basically, the difference, though, is that accipiters are kind of forest hawks. They're sort of like cross between a buteo and a falcon. They've got some streamlined features, but then they've also got some bulky features like buteo hawks have. They tend to be really maneuverable between trees. Buteo hawks, you tend to see sometimes in riparian or wooded areas along creeks, like down at the campground in McCabe Canyon, but you also see them in open areas, especially things like red-tailed hawks. They're in the buteo hawk group. And then to the right of that, you have golden eagles. There are bald eagles that fly around, but we don't have any that nest in the park because they require water, at least more water than we've got here. Golden eagles are found all over areas with open range. They're quite a bit bigger than the others, too. So those are the main daytime or diurnal raptors that we have. We also have a few other specialist weird ones like white-tailed kites and also northern harriers. You'll see those down in the bottomlands in particular. They're specialists, so they have very particular types of prey that they eat, particularly voles. But yeah, so there are a couple that don't fit in those other groups but are still around here. And then we've got all the owl species here. This is a nestling of a great horned owl. You're not going to see those as much. Sometimes they'll flush into some trees, but you can definitely hear them. And later on, if you have questions about what they sound like, I can definitely answer and probably imitate some of those calls. Okay, so why is raptor monitoring important? We just kind of went through Raptor 101 with what we've got here. Does anybody have any ideas about why it might be important to monitor raptors?
Wait, is that the only owl we have? Surely not.
No.
Okay.
I was just kind of showing that because just to show that we have some owls here.
Okay.
You're not going to see owls much. We'll see a few more images of owls later, and I can talk about that later. But usually what people are seeing, visitors as well as folks working here, are stuff in the daytime because it's day. You can actually see what's around. So anyway.
So are you tracking like the health and the activity of these different things?
Yeah, that's fine. Anybody else have thoughts about why raptors might be important?
They're at the top of the food chain.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So they could accumulate toxins in the environment.
Yep.
See how healthy they are.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one.
Also, also monitor the food sources.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so those are both really good points. And that kind of gets to the third part. Raptors, like other predators, are really good indicators of ecological health because they're at the top of the food chain. If they're doing well, then you have a pretty good sense of what they're eating is doing well too, and what they're eating. If they say they're eating squirrels or other small birds that eat seeds or grass, well, then your habitat overall in a particular area is probably doing well. Just some other things we've got here too. A lot of the raptors we have here are species of concern tracked by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Prairie falcons, like this one pictured here, are definitely in that mix, as are peregrines, golden eagles, some of the accipiter species like sharp-shinned hawks that I showed before. Another thing that's significant here is that we've been looking at raptor monitoring at Pinnacles for quite a while. If you look at some of the old maps, like the 1920s and 30s maps, you'll see these big areas in the balconies that say peregrine sanctuary. But even back then, there was a sense that there was something kind of significant about the cliffs here for nesting birds, particularly peregrine and prairie falcons that use cliffs cavities.
Excuse me, yeah. Have you found that the falcons continue going back to the same eyries?
Yes. I'll talk about that a little more later, but falcons in particular, the larger ones like prairie and peregrine falcons that we have nesting here, they're pretty temperamental, pretty territorial. So year after year, you do often see the same areas occupied over and over again, and that's partly because the park's not that big, and within that, there's only limited cliff cavity nesting that's available. So it's pretty well occupied every year.
Gavin, what would prompt way back then
I think there were just there were park biologists who were in the area back then, and especially as there was talk of potentially putting a road through the balconies area, the cave area there, people started looking at and noticing that there were birds that were disturbed by people around. If you're hiking around the high peaks on the west side, sometimes you have security birds wailing or kind of crying out overhead, and they'll do other things like stoop or dive at you too if they're really disturbed. So I'm sure that people kind of connected that to human presence, and that had some significant implications for how the park was managed. Okay, so why do we monitor prairie falcons? This is a species that we monitor in particular at this park. I don't expect you to necessarily know these things, so I'll just throw you a few interesting tidbits. For one thing, we've got a really high concentration of nesting prairie falcons. It's the highest of any national park unit at this park. There's another area that has quite a high concentration is Snake River Birds of Prairie in Idaho, but that's not part of the Park Service. And it's got high concentrations of also raptors too. One thing that's kind of interesting about prairie falcons, a lot of people, because of the DDT poisoning issues that brought them into the public space in the 60s and beyond, a lot of people are really familiar with peregrine falcons. Not as many people are familiar with prairie falcons, so when I say that I study them, sometimes people go, what are those? Or they're pretty similar in size to peregrines, but unlike peregrines, which migrate really long distances or can migrate long distances, prairie falcons are only found in North America. So in some ways you could say they're kind of the quintessential North American falcon, much more so than something like a peregrine. The other reason we monitor them here is that we've been doing it at Pinnacles for, well, this is now the 27th year of the program. It's the longest consecutive running raptor monitoring program in the country, both in the National Park Service and outside of that, and particularly related to prairie falcons. So this is kind of the message that, if you take nothing else away from today, that I'd like you to kind of think about, is that the main reason that we're doing this program is because it's a way of balancing resource protection with visitor access. We're trying to have responsible management of the resources so that these birds can reproduce year after year, nest and produce young, but we're also trying to allow visitors, particularly off-trail hikers and climbers, to have access to resources. So by trying to balance that out, we're trying to meet the different needs that we have as a Park Service unit.
Well, where does the prairie falcon nest?
The prairie falcon nests in cliff cavities. Falcons in general, they don't build nests. Other raptors like red-tailed hawks or I mean, pretty much any hawk, sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, white-tailed kites, they'll all kind of grab stick material and then build a stick construct that then put their eggs in. Falcons don't do that. They'll sort of find a cavity, clear out a scrape with their body, a little bowl of dirt or something like that, and they'll just dump their eggs straight in there. Even though condors are not raptors, they kind of do a similar thing. Owls do that too. They don't build their own nests. They'll sort of reuse constructs from other raptors, or they'll just put their eggs into a cavity. Smaller falcons, like kestrels, will also use trees. They'll go into like an oak cavity, like we have a lot of in the park, and sometimes they'll use that and just dump their eggs in there.
So we're more likely to see prairie falcons up around.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially for nesting habitat, they're going to be up in the cliffs or near the rock. When you're kind of driving around along Highway 25, they tend to feed in open areas, hence the name Prairie Falcon. So you'll see them in prairie, ranchland, grassland areas. And you will see them foraging around there as you're driving around as well.
Okay. And they're about how big? Like...
I'll talk about that here. Okay. If people are familiar with peregrine falcons, it kind of is a good segue into this. How are prairie and peregrine falcons different? This is actually a question that visitors ask a lot once I tell them I'm looking at them, and you might get visitors asking you as well. This is a peregrine falcon. You can see that they've got this kind of dark helmet on their head, and then they've got this consistent banding across their body on their wings, their chest and belly. So prairie falcons are very similar in size and shape. They're about the same size, so I guess they could stand about that big and maybe 3.5 foot wingspan, something like that. So a pretty stocky falcon, real muscled. But in terms of the plumage or coloration and some foraging habits, prairie falcons are a bit different. So here's a prairie falcon by comparison. It's sort of, kind of turning in the air, hence its shape. But in terms of shape and size, you can see they're pretty similar. They're kind of sized to show that. But one thing that's real distinctive about prairie falcons, they've got a bit of spotting on their body, but it looks kind of whitish in flight. And one thing that's real characteristic is that they have this dark armpit, or the feathers that are called axillaries are dark in contrast to the rest of the body when you're looking from below. So that's those are some things that are kind of different. In terms of hunting techniques, peregrines are well known for basically circling up and then diving and knocking things from the sky, particularly birds. Prairie falcons don't do that as much. Sometimes they will when they're going after a pigeon or something like that, but they often will use the tactic of flying close to the ground, flushing something, and then grabbing it. So they're kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to preying on things, whereas peregrines are an aerial predator, pretty much singly. Peregrines also tend to feed on birds, whereas prairie falcons will feed on all sorts of things, but particularly on mammals as well as small and mid-sized birds. That's one of the reasons that during the DDT poisoning of the 60s and beyond, prairie falcons didn't crash in populations as much. Birds tend to accumulate DDT in their flesh more, so peregrines, when they ate birds a lot, they couldn't help having really high DDT levels. Because prairie falcons eat ground squirrels and things like that, they didn't have as high of a load, so their eggshells didn't thin as much, so they didn't kind of crash as much as peregrines did.
Yeah, nice. But
Yeah.
I was hiking the other day on the Balconies Cave trail, and met a gentleman who's a birder, had binoculars, was quite conversive about species and stuff, and didn't seem like he was telling tall tales.
Yeah.
But told me he saw a prairie falcon stoop a condor. So I took a compass reading. It was northeast of the cave entrance. And I mean, one of these things taking on a 9-foot airplane. I mean,
yeah. Falcons. One of the reasons I think that peregrines, and I suppose, that peregrines are so popular is because they're so aggressive. People sort of like that idea that it's this small thing that they can just knock other things out of the sky, and it gets really upset and temperamental when they come across much larger birds. So you will see that with some frequency, particularly when the condors were first being released here. Prairie falcons, as well as the peregrine falcon pair, which we have nesting at Hawkins every year for the last 6 or 7 years, they would chase condors, and they still do, out of their territories, and they'll, try to dive at them. Yeah.
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, they're quite aggressive. I think part of the reason is that prairie and peregrine falcons are kind of a mid-sized raptor, so even though they can prey on a lot of stuff, they're also threatened by larger things. Things like great horned owls and then golden eagles, red-tailed hawks will predate their nests, so they'll go in and eat their eggs or their young. So as a result, these mid-sized falcons feel kind of threatened by a lot of other stuff that's bigger in the sky, so they'll go after them. And I think at some level, even things like turkey vultures and condors, which don't present any threat to them, they'll just sort of make a point by diving at them, and it's just to let other birds in the area know, hey, we have this territory, stay out.
So it's territorial.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. So yeah, these are some things about them. All right. So how do we monitor raptors at Pinnacles? This is Nate, who helps me with raptor monitoring. For those of you that don't know him, I'm sure you'll probably see him around if you haven't met him yet. We use binoculars and scopes, gear that allows us to see things from quite far away. We're looking at two main things. We're looking at occupancy and productivity. What those terms basically mean is where are they and what are they doing when they're nesting. What territories are they occupying in the park, and are they producing eggs, hatchlings? How many of those nestlings are then going on a fledge or fly from the nests? We're doing this because, again, it comes back to the idea of management. If we have specific information on this, then we can offer better recommendations for visitors, and we can also limit the areas that we have as closure areas every year. And as the season goes on, too. They're kind of modified depending on what the birds are doing. Some of the tools that we're using, in addition to just writing field notes in the field, we have data sheets that then get entered into Access databases, so we have archived data that we can compare for trend reports and analyses. We also take GPS readings on all of the watch spots as well as where the nests are, so we have a GIS database with all of this information available for us as well as future people that are monitoring. This information is also sent on to some different agencies like California Department of Fish and Wildlife, so that they have this stuff on record if there are any researchers that want to have a better sense of what's going on regionally in California. Okay, so where do we monitor prairie falcons? As I already mentioned, they use different cliff cavities. We have somewhat limited cliff habitat in the park, but it's definitely a lot more in concentration than you have anywhere else in the surrounding ranchland and habitat. That's probably the reason we have so many prairie falcons nesting in this particular park. So these blobs here, the pink blobs and the blue blobs, are areas that we've looked at through ground truthing as well as GIS modeling to determine this is where prairie falcons can potentially nest in the park, or peregrine falcons by extension. The pink areas are core areas, the bluish blobs are non-core areas. Basically the difference between these is the core areas have historic use by visitors for off-trail hiking, climbing, stuff like that. So there's the potential that people can disturb these birds in these areas. The blue areas, they have cliff areas in it that are pretty much inaccessible to people. So they don't really have that threat of being disturbed, the birds in those areas. Kind of look at that a little bit more. You'll notice that the core area kind of represents a central part of the park. It also covers in the middle the high peaks. Above there, that's sort of where balconies and machete are, and then down sort of in the, I guess, lower right areas where the yaks are, little pinnacles. So it's all that area where you tend to see the most rock in the park. Okay, so we use Raptor Advisories here. I called them closures before. The advisories are pretty much voluntary closures. We don't require that people stay out of these areas. In some places like Yosemite, they have mandatory closures. We've kind of figured out through the number of years that we've had the program going that it seems to work better especially working with climbers, if we can empower them to make the decision to stay out of these areas. It also makes them feel more appreciated, respected, part of the process. So that's where that terminology comes from. So we're using these advisories. Again, the whole idea, as I mentioned before, is to kind of balance out use of these areas by visitors with protection of the birds while they're nesting in these areas. So, what areas are affected by advisories? We kind of already looked at that with the core and non-core areas. There are advisory signs that are posted in cement brackets in the ground at these following areas. If you don't know where these areas are, that's fine, especially for some of you that are new. This is part of the brochure that I have that should be available to visitors in the visitor centers. You can also look on the websites and click on the Climber Advisory and Raptor Advisory links to have a PDF of this information as well. Beyond that, just kind of look through the climbing guidebooks that we have in the visitor centers and figure this stuff out that way. And if you have information beyond that, when you go out in ground truth by hiking the trails, I can certainly answer some of that information. All right, so just talking about climbers a bit. So what about climbers? There's quite a long tradition of climbing at the park since the 1950s. We've had people like David Brower, a number of people that then went on to do really famous routes in Yosemite and other places. So this has been kind of a testing ground for a lot of climbing over the years. And there's still kind of an ongoing and very supportive community of climbers that are in this area. This guy here, Dennis Eric Strom, actually maintains a website with pretty up-to-date information that helps to give people details on what's going on in the park. There's another website maintained by Friends of Pinnacles that does the same too, and they also maintain bolts that are getting kind of old and potentially unsafe in the park. So there are a lot of these people get out into the park a lot, and they feel pretty passionate about the resource, not just climbing, but they love seeing birds as well as wildlife and kind of open areas and remote areas. So they're good stewards of the park, and it's important that we continue to keep them in the loop. So we've got other people climbing here. This is Alicia, this is Scott, both of whom work with the Condor crew. This is Brad Young, who wrote the most recent climbing guidebook. You can kind of see all this just massive, nasty looking web in there. I did this climb with him last year, and we removed all this stuff. It's basically plastic-based webbing, which is, when it's new, it's very strong. When it gets sun damaged, it gets very unsafe. So we were removing it and putting in a metal anchor so that people could be safer. This was on balconies prior to the closure going into effect. So there are a lot of us that get out there and maintain the routes so that they're safe as well, and are very cognizant of the fact that we need to do this when the birds aren't around. So yeah, then that's me just looking goofy with the chain actually in place. So yeah, again, sort of take-home message from this idea about climbers. Climbers are good stewards, our allies, and our friends, and there are a number of people here that do at least some climbing as well. So don't consider them to be kind of an enemy or people that are opposed to what's going on at the advisories. They're very in support of it.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Yeah.
Is this chain bolted into the post
Yes.
coming down to a singular point?
Yeah, that's correct.
Ah.
Yeah, and the idea behind that, usually with climbing, you try to put some redundancy in so that if one of the bolts, God forbid, busts out of the rock, you still have another in place that's going to keep you there. It's even better is if you have 3 bolts, and then you try to have chains that are equalized so that they're all carrying the load of a person the same amount.
Belt and suspenders operation.
What's that?
It's a belt and suspenders operation.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so what other birds of prey do we have here? We kind of talked about that a little bit, but Pinnacles is quite diverse for raptor nesting here. We have at least 14 documented species of raptors that nest at the park. When you consider how big the park is, 26,000 acres, give or take, that's quite a bit compared to most other places. I mean, even other places in California you can think of. And the reason for that probably is that we have really compressed habitats here. You probably noticed that it sort of looks like somebody's taken a towel and shoved it together here. You've got a lot of ridges and gullies, and that's allowed a lot of different habitats to form. We've got a lot of chaparral, we've got some cliffs, but we've also got sycamore and pine oak woodland, canyons. We've got bottomlands with valley oaks. There's a lot going on. Because there's a lot going on, there are a lot of prey species and then a lot of raptors that can take advantage of that. So some of the species we have that nest here, golden eagles, like I mentioned, peregrines. This is a picture of a fledgling I took last year. Lon Eared Owls, another one of the kind of mid-size or larger owls we have. Cooper's hawks. Here's a juvenile, and barn owls, which nest in barns and other human structures, but also in cliff cavities. So how can we help? By we, I mean staff in general, and also all of you in particular. So here are just some things to think about, especially if you're particularly motivated in regards to raptors. Just having the motivation to gain knowledge. Practice ID, look at guidebooks so that you actually can sort of know what you're looking at. If you see something rather than, well, I saw this raptor flying around. It's like, well, what color was it? Well, you know, it's kind of brownish and lightish. And, you know, like look for particular characteristics that define them. You know, there are a lot of references we have in the park, like in the visitor center. The Sibley guide is particularly good just for general birds, and it also has pretty accurate depictions of different raptors. We have stuff in the resource office that I can refer you to as well if you're interested. If you do see raptors, one thing that's really helpful for me is if you record all raptor observations, both from visitors and yourself. Any weather information, particular things they found, if they know the species, or if you know the species, say, okay, this is what it was and this is what it was doing. All of that stuff, it's great to have a word of mouth. Just like, hey, I saw a red-tail the other day and it was stooping at ravens and chasing them out of the cedar. Well, that's nice, but it's better for me if I actually have that information in writing so I can enter it into the database. Then we can refer back to it and look at it later in the season when those birds are actually nesting. So just keep that in mind. Even if it's just a scratch piece of paper, if you don't have an observation card, anything will do.
Gavin, do you have those observation cards with you? Or?
I don't have them here, but we do have them in the office, and I don't know.
I think at the Pinnacles Visitor Center,
Yes,
there's
I was
some
going to
down
say
there.
there should be some.
I'm not
down
sure
there.
on the west side if you guys have them.
Yeah. So yeah, you can kind of look at that format for what is expected.
Gavin, I was going to say, I mean, when looking at raptors, I remember years ago I took an avian biology class. It was like tail shape and wing shape were two of the major features that would help you identify. Is that so? I mean, what are other things?
Yeah, tail and wing shape can help. Also, just coloration. There are certain species that you'll find in certain habitats too, but they're very unlikely in other habitats. Like red-shouldered hawks. Some of you that work at or near the visitor center probably notice these hawks that are really active there in the trees, and they have this call that's kind of like it just like keeps going and going. It's really loud and obnoxious. Well, red-shouldered hawks tend to nest along wooded corridors and creeks. You're not going to find them out in the bottomlands where it's drier. You won't find them at all up in the rocky areas. So just knowing where raptors tend to be can help you cut down on the amount that you're looking at. Coloration can be a concern. How big they are, you know, how thick-looking are their wings and their tail. Things like prairie falcons here, their head looks kind of compact compared to some other raptors where it sticks out more and the beak is a little more distinct. So all those different things, and again, looking at guidebooks can kind of help you figure that out. And you know, just going out into the park and looking at birds and then having a guidebook there, or you know, if you have an iPod, you have iBird on it, that's a really good resource, or any of the other electronic guides that you can just put onto a device like that. I try to be pretty careful about the specifics of where birds are nesting. I'll kind of mention an area like balconies, but I won't say, you know, on the second tier in this area along this climbing route, like I don't say stuff like that, but just keep that in mind that we don't really want visitors to be going right up to these sites and disturbing the birds, so try to be cognizant of that in protecting sensitive information about raptors. And if you have any concerns or questions or you're not sure, just let me know and I can tell you sort of what I prefer.
Is the general advice is stay on the trail and you see them?
Yes, and I mean, you know, let's face it, we do have a park with a lot of wilderness, as we now know, and it is fine for people to go off trail. They just should be aware of where the advisory areas are. Usually along trails where there are usual areas that climbers use for access, there are posted signs, so then people can read and say, oh, okay, I'm not supposed to go there. But as people come into the visitor center or by the booth, you know, if they have questions about that, just say, hey, you know, just to let you know, we have these advisories in effect, and these are the areas that they apply to. So yeah, if people want to go off trail, that's fine, but they should be kind of aware of the fact that there are these cliffs that the birds are using.
I was kind of confused yesterday. We had Jason over, and about the advisories, he said we could get them in trouble for being in the closure, you know, the advisory areas. So, is it legal for them to go or not? Or
that's a good question.
Yeah,
we call them voluntary closures because we're basically saying, well, we discourage people from, especially climbing in areas that are under advisory. We can't technically do anything to them unless it's observed that birds are responding and getting disturbed from their presence. That's a citable offense, disturbing wildlife. So at that point, law enforcement rangers can come in and slap a ticket on people.
Okay.
So just for being in that area, if there isn't any disturbance for the birds, there's not really anything we can do about it. So usually the tactic that I take is, hey, just to let you know, these areas are under advisory. We prefer if you aren't in these areas. There are birds nesting here that may be disturbed by your presence. If you see birds disturbed and they say, you need to get out of this area, you know, the wildlife is being disturbed here, and people say, you know, I'm not going to listen to that, I'm just going to stay here. Then you can be like, okay, I'm going to call law enforcement on the radio, and they'll come and escort you out of here with a ticket.
If you see the birds being disturbed?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and like I said before, it is fairly distinctive when birds are disturbed. They'll start diving at you, they'll start calling and circling over you, things like that. They make themselves known, and they make it known that they're not happy with your presence.
So the voluntary advisors are just kind of like helping people stay away from them?
Yes, and most people are pretty respectful of that, so that's why we've stayed with that system up to this point.
That's neat.
What's that?
That's neat.
Yeah.
Gotta take the high road.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's about it. So one more time, just kind of a take-home message here. You know, it's great for visitors to enjoy the beauty and the kind of unique diversity of birds of prey we have here, but help us protect them so that other people can come and experience and enjoy that as well. Any further questions?
What we hear owls in the housing area at night. Are there different types of owls there? Or
There are different types of owls. Great horned owl, most people are pretty familiar with. It's sort of the distinctive owl call that everybody hears. Like, it's kind of low and booming. There's also one that sounds almost like a saw going back and forth. And it just kind of keeps going and going. That's a northern saw-whet owl. It sort of sounds like a saw going back and forth through a tree. They're kind of a small, fuzzy owl. You don't see them much. They probably nest in the park with some regularity, but we don't have a lot of records of them because they start calling at this time of year and then sort of stop calling. So it's really hard to locate them. They'll nest in cavities of trees too, and if it's deep enough, you just won't see them at all. There are also western screech owls. It's another small owl that have kind of little ear tufts, and they are also in wooded areas. So you'll hear them in the campground and the housing areas up near headquarters. And their call sounds sort of like it's almost like a ball that's like a ping pong ball that's being dropped, and it gets faster through the call. It's like, so it kind of has that sound to it. It changes frequency and gets faster as it goes on.
what's that one?
Western screech owl. Screech owls are actually misnamed. They don't actually screech because when naturalists were first on the East Coast, they heard a barn owl, which does sound like sort of a horrendous screech, or like it sounds kind of like a baby crying or screeching. And then they saw a screech owl and they mistook it. They thought that's what it was calling, so they went, oh, I'll call this a screech owl. So they don't actually screech. It's barn owls that screech.
Sometimes they whinny.
Yeah, barn owls.
No, eastern screech.
Oh yeah, they will sometimes, but they don't really have that kind of like, that sort of ear-splitting screech call that barn owls have. And then Lon Eared Owl is the one that I showed before, and it's the one owl species we have in the park that's sort of a sensitive species of concern. They have sort of a low single note that's monotonous, and sometimes they'll repeat it every 10 or 15 seconds, but sometimes it can go quite a bit before they call. It just goes, and that's basically it. They just keep going with that call.
What's that?
Lon Eared Owl. Yeah, it kind of looks, it was that one that I showed before that looks a bit like a great horned owl, but a little more, I don't know, sort of elegant, the lines of it or something. What's that?
Just like
You can if you want. But yeah, so
What
those
is
are
this thing?
this is a Prairie Falcon nestling, and I was able to photograph this while doing a nest entry. We've been doing some research on Prairie Falcons the last few years with Dr. Doug Bell, who's kind of works with East Bay Parks in the Bay, and they're in the literature. Based on studies up north, there's kind of the suggestion that prairie falcons migrate in the winter. That in the winter it gets too cold, they don't have food sources, and they migrate sort of to the Midwest where different types of prey species are available. In California, though, we've got a Mediterranean climate in this area in central California, so a lot of things that might need to migrate elsewhere don't need to migrate here. The weather's nice all year round, they've got prey all year round. So with that in mind, we've kind of been thinking, well, and based on some telemetry work we did here several years back, we thought, well, the prairie falcons here might not need to migrate at all, and they might not be getting a lot of influx of new blood from birds that are coming in as a result. If that's true, the implication is that any risk factors that might threaten this population could lead to a crash. So that would definitely adjust our management threshold for any sort of action. So we've been doing some nest entries to get blood samples from nestlings to see how genetically related they are. So anyway, that's...
What did you find?
It's ongoing. We haven't gotten enough samples yet to say anything definitive. From some work that he's already published for the Bay Area, which should be kind of similar in terms of climate, they have been finding that the populations are pretty close, they're pretty insular. There's not a lot of influx coming in. Basically, the new birds they have are what they're able to produce year after year.
So it's the same genetic strand.
Yeah.
So what could bring in more of the other families that could have that intermix going on?
Well, there's always some dispersal that goes on with birds, so it's certainly possible that there are some rock faces as you're driving along 25, for example, that you see, small rock faces, and it's likely that prairie falcons nest there as well. And even further afield, if there are territories that are already occupied by adult birds, then younger birds that are maybe looking to set up a territory might go further afield. So I'm sure we get some influx, just probably not that much. Yeah. So I would say if there was a complete population crash and if this place was just totally devoid of prairie falcons, over a number of years, you'd get some of those long-range dispersers that would eventually come in and fill in again. But it could be quite a while if the population is as insular as we suspect.
I have a question.
Yep.
How do you monitor birds without disturbing them, or do you disturb them a little bit?
When we're using binoculars and scopes, we have scopes that are 20 to 60 powered, so you can often watch birds from a half a mile away without them being disturbed at all. Usually, most raptors have telescopic vision. I mean, you can tell from the huge eyes in their head, so they basically got sort of binoculars or scopes in their head, so they can see you from a distance too. And even when I'm that far away, I often notice, oh, these birds are staring at me occasionally. So you kind of think, no, they don't know I'm here, and then they look straight at you. Occasionally, like, okay. So, but they don't respond with any sort of defensive or aggressive behavior from that distance. And especially for things like prairie and peregrine falcons, because they're on cliff faces, it allows you to be that far away, because if you find an open perch, you can see these birds flying around and perching if you know how to locate them while they're perched there. So yeah, we're able to watch them without disturbing them.
What about nest entries?
Nest entries do disturb them, but through lots of years of research by us, but particularly other researchers over the years, the adults will get pretty disturbed for a brief amount of time, and then as soon as we're gone, they'll go back to just feeding the young. And as long as they can see they're still in there and they're active and calling for food, their instinct to feed them and to tend to them is so strong that they'll just keep going with them.
What do they do to you when you're in there? Are they like...
The adults will sometimes stoop at you, they'll try to dive at you. They don't usually hit you, but they will at least have sort of stoops where they get close to you to let you know they're really unhappy with your presence.
Yeah, my question was related with the question that Lupe. So when you take a photo as close as this one, so you have something special in your camera that don't affect them when you are taking a close photo of this.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, like when we're doing nest entries, just to document them and what's going on in them. Not frequently, but sometimes just to say, okay, you know, this is what the nest cavity and the young look like for interpretation purposes. Yeah, I'll just have like a camera with me sometimes with a flash, it's a dark cavity. Take a few quick shots, boom, keep going. It's not like a long